about the newly assembled Philadelphia 76ers roster and offered a take that nobody was fully prepared for. The Sixers, now featuring LeBron James, Joel Embiid, Jaylen Brown, and Tyrese Maxey, had already generated enormous buzz across the basketball world simply by coming together on paper. Fans were calling it one of the most star-studded rosters in modern NBA history, and comparisons to other elite teams started flooding social media almost immediately. That is when Durant stepped in and compared the new-look Philadelphia roster to the legendary 2016 to 2017 Golden State Warriors, a team widely considered one of the greatest ever assembled in the history of the league. The reaction was instant. Fans who had spent years studying and celebrating that Warriors dynasty pushed back hard, arguing that no roster built in the present moment could realistically compare to a team that finished the regular season with 67 wins and then went on to win a championship in dominant fashion. But it wasn't just the comparison itself that got people talking. It was what Durant said next that truly lit the fuse. As the debate grew louder and more people demanded he explain his reasoning, Durant leaned further into his argument by breaking down individual players from both rosters side by side. He stacked up statistics, accolades, and career accomplishments, trying to build a case on paper that the current 76ers could hold their own against the dynasty he once won championships with. On the surface, it seemed like a straightforward basketball discussion from a player who has always evaluated the game through the lens of individual talent and elite offensive production. But the more people analyzed what he was actually saying, the more it became clear that this argument required minimizing the resumes of two very specific former teammates, and making the case that the Warriors were not as dominant on paper as people remember. Durant appeared to question the individual accomplishments of Klay Thompson and Draymond Green, two players who sacrificed personal statistics, individual recognition, and scoring opportunities to build something larger than themselves in Golden State. Fans immediately saw it for what it was. Whether Durant intended it as a direct shot or not, the basketball world treated his comments as a sneak diss toward the very teammates who helped him capture 2 NBA championships and 2 Finals MVP awards. And once that interpretation took hold, there was no pulling it back. Klay Thompson's response was, "One of the first things that told you this situation had moved beyond a normal social media debate. Klay has built a well-earned reputation throughout his career as one of the more composed stars in the league. He rarely engages in public back and forth, almost never inserts himself into controversy, and has historically preferred letting his play on the court speak for him rather than spending time arguing on the internet." So when Klay decided to respond instead of staying quiet, it immediately signaled that Durant's comments had genuinely touched a nerve. Klay defended both his own legacy and the overall accomplishments of the Warriors dynasty with a clarity and conviction that surprised a lot of people who expected him to simply let it go. He pushed back against the idea that championships, sacrifice, and elite team defense could be measured through MVP voting or individual scoring averages, making a point that the greatness of those Golden State teams was built on things that never fully show up in a box score. His defense of his own career was measured but firm, and his defense of the dynasty felt personal in a way that went beyond basketball analysis. The fact that Klay, of all people, felt strongly enough to break his usual silence and respond publicly became one of the most significant talking points of the entire controversy. It told the basketball world that for Klay Thompson, this was not just about one comment. It was about years of being undervalued in a broader conversation about who actually deserved credit for what those Warriors teams accomplished. Think about what Klay actually brought to those championship rosters. He was a 5-time All-Star, one of the greatest shooters in the history of the sport, and a two-way player whose ability to guard the opposing team's best perimeter scorer gave Golden State a defensive dimension that most championship teams simply do not have. He shot the ball at an extraordinary clip across multiple championship runs, delivered some of the most iconic shooting performances in NBA playoff history, and did all of it while consistently accepting a secondary offensive role behind Stephen Curry. He never complained publicly, never demanded more shots, and never positioned himself above the team. For Durant to make a comparison that seemed to treat Klay as a complementary piece rather than one of the defining players of a dynasty was always going to land differently than a random basketball take from someone with no connection to those teams. Coming from Durant specifically, who was in that locker room, who benefited from Klay's selfless play and elite shooting on a nightly basis, the comment carried a weight that a stranger's opinion never could. Then Draymond Green entered the conversation, and everything escalated to a completely different level. Draymond has never needed a reason to be outspoken, but this time he had genuine conviction behind every word, and it showed. He jumped into the discussion almost immediately after Durant's comments began spreading widely, using social media to defend the Warriors' dynasty and push back against the narrative that individual statistics could accurately represent what those championship teams were built on. But Draymond did not stop there, because he never stops there. He brought up Durant's long and well-documented history with anonymous social media accounts, weaving it into his response in a way that was both pointed and effective, turning what could have been a straightforward basketball debate into one of the most viral exchanges of the entire offseason. His posts spread rapidly across NBA discussions, with fans and analysts sharing them across every major platform within hours. What made it land so hard was not just the content, but the delivery. Draymond did not sound defensive. He sounded like someone who had been waiting patiently for exactly this moment and was thoroughly enjoying every second of it. The discussion did not end on social media though. Draymond brought the conversation to an episode of the Draymond Green Show, where he took time to actually analyze Durant's perspective in a more structured and detailed way. Rather than dismissing Durant outright, Draymond acknowledged something important. He recognized that Durant has always viewed basketball primarily through the lens of scoring and offensive production, and that for someone who built his entire legacy on being one of the most efficient and versatile scorers the sport has ever produced, it made a certain kind of sense that he would evaluate teams through that same framework. But acknowledging Durant's perspective and agreeing with it are two very different things, and Draymond made that distinction clear. He argued that using points and individual accolades as the primary measuring stick for comparing rosters fundamentally misses everything that made Golden State historically dominant. He pointed to the defensive identity of those Warriors teams, the selfless ball movement, the way every player accepted a role smaller than their talent deserved, and the trust that developed through years of shared struggle and shared success. For Draymond, basketball success cannot be reduced to who has the most impressive individual resume, and he made sure everyone watching understood exactly why he felt that way. He walked through the specific ways Golden State's championship teams were built, explaining how the Warriors ran one of the most sophisticated offensive systems in league history, one that required every player to be a willing passer, a constant mover without the ball, and a genuine threat from multiple spots on the floor. That system worked because of trust built over years, not because of individual brilliance assembled on a spreadsheet. Draymond also made the broader point that defensive identity is what separates good teams from great ones, and that the Warriors had an elite defensive presence across multiple championship runs that rarely gets included when people try to compare rosters on paper. His willingness to go deep on the basketball argument, rather than just trading insults, is what gave his response the staying power that most social media exchanges never achieve. People were not just entertained by Draymond, they were actually convinced by him, and that combination is what turned his reaction into the defining response of the entire controversy. To really understand why all of this is hitting as hard as it is, you have to go back further than the summer of 2026. The tension between Durant and his former Warriors teammates did not appear out of nowhere. Many NBA fans and analysts believe it has existed in some form ever since Durant left Golden State following the 2018 to 2019 season, choosing to sign with the Brooklyn Nets and beginning what turned out to be a complicated next chapter of his career. His departure from Golden State sparked years of speculation about whether Durant ever truly felt at home within the Warriors' championship culture. The system Stephen Curry, Klay Thompson, and Draymond Green had built together before Durant arrived was deeply rooted in selflessness, ball movement, and collective sacrifice. Players accepted smaller roles and reduced statistics for the good of the team, and that culture was already deeply embedded by the time Durant joined in 2016. Many observers noted over the years that while Durant thrived within that system and produced at an extraordinary level, he sometimes seemed to occupy a complicated space within it, never fully belonging to the original core in the way the others did, despite being one of the most gifted players on the roster. The Warriors before Durant arrived were already a championship team. They had won the title in 2015 and come agonizingly close to repeating in 2016, losing a 3-1 series lead to LeBron James and the Cleveland Cavaliers. When Durant joined that summer, the dynamic of the team shifted in ways that were both immediately obvious and quietly complicated. On the court, the addition made them nearly unbeatable. Off the court, the question of how a player of Durant's caliber and ego fits into an already established championship culture was never fully answered in the 3 seasons they played together. He won 2 titles and 2 finals MVPs, numbers that speak for themselves, but the feeling that he was always slightly adjacent to the Warriors' true identity rather than fully embedded within it never completely went away, and that perception has followed every conversation about his time at Golden State ever since. That underlying tension became impossible to ignore in 2018, when one of the most famous on-court confrontations in Warriors history unfolded during a game against the Los Angeles Clippers. Durant and Draymond Green became involved in a heated argument that spilled into the locker room, eventually resulting in Draymond receiving a 1-game suspension that many felt contributed directly to Golden State's first-round exit that postseason. Both players later insisted publicly that they had moved past the incident and that their relationship remained strong, but the basketball world never fully accepted that explanation. The confrontation became one of the defining moments of the Warriors dynasty, not because of what it said about either player individually, but because of what it revealed about the fault lines running beneath the surface of a team that appeared dominant and unified from the outside. Every time Durant and his former teammates find themselves in the middle of a public dispute, that confrontation gets brought back up, and for good reason. It was the moment that made the eventual split feel inevitable in hindsight. Then came 2022, and everything shifted again. Golden State captured the 4th NBA championship that year, doing it with Stephen Curry, Klay Thompson, Draymond Green, and a new generation of complementary players built around the original core. It was a significant and emotional title for everyone involved, but it also reignited every conversation surrounding Durant's role in the Warriors story. Some fans celebrated the win as proof that Golden State's championship identity was always built around Curry, Klay, and Draymond, and that Durant had been a talented but temporary addition rather than a permanent part of the foundation. Others pushed back on that interpretation, arguing that Durant's true titles with the team were every bit as legitimate and that reducing him to a side character in the Warriors' narrative was unfair to everything he actually contributed. Neither side ever fully convinced the other, and the debate never really disappeared. It just went underground, quietly waiting for the next moment to resurface. What made the 2022 championship particularly significant in this context was the way Klay's personal story added an emotional layer that made it nearly impossible not to celebrate him specifically. He had missed over 2.5 years of basketball after suffering a torn ACL in the 2019 finals, and then a torn Achilles during his recovery. The fact that he came back from both devastating injuries and played a meaningful role in Golden State's 4th title made his story one of the most compelling in recent sports history. The celebration around him was enormous, and rightfully so. But it also meant that the public narrative around the 2022 title was heavily centered on the original Warriors core, which inevitably reignited every conversation about what Durant's departure had meant for that group. That moment arrived on the summer of 2026, and here we are. Before any of that could fully settle, a separate controversy surrounding Durant added even more fuel to an already complicated situation. During NBA All-Star Weekend in February of 2026, screenshots from an alleged anonymous social media account, widely believed online to belong to Durant, began circulating across the internet at a rapid pace. What made this particular situation stand out from previous burner account controversies linked to Durant was the nature of the alleged content. Rather than focusing on defending himself from public criticism, these alleged messages appear to take direct shots at several active NBA players and former teammates, generating enormous media attention throughout the entire All-Star Weekend. Durant's connection to the account was never officially confirmed, but the widespread belief that it belonged to him was enough to dominate the conversation and further complicate his already strained relationships with several people around the league. Draymond did not let that one pass either. He addressed the burner account controversy publicly, criticizing the awkward and damaging position the alleged leaks created for Durant. He made the point that walking back into an NBA locker room after something like that becomes public will create an uncomfortable and nearly impossible environment for everyone involved, not just Durant. His broader argument was straightforward. When criticism of teammates or former teammates becomes public, whether through direct statements or alleged anonymous accounts, accountability becomes unavoidable. Avoiding direct conversations only allows speculation and resentment to grow louder over time. And rebuilding trust after a situation like that requires more than simply moving on and pretending it never happened. Draymond has always been direct to a fault, but in this case his point carried real weight because it spoke to something larger than one alleged social media account. It spoke to the entire pattern of how Durant navigates public disagreements. What often gets overlooked in this entire conversation is how the relationship between Durant and Klay specifically evolved after they stopped being teammates. When Durant left for Brooklyn in 2019, Klay never made a loud public statement about the departure. He did not give lengthy interviews about what it meant or how it affected the team. He stayed quiet the way he almost always does. But over the years, small moments told a different story. Whenever Durant's name came up in conversations about the Warriors dynasty, Klay's responses were noticeably measured, careful in a way that suggested there were things left unsaid, rather than things he had fully made peace with. There were interviews where Klay spoke warmly about Stephen Curry and Draymond Green, but noticeably less so about Durant. There were moments where questions about that championship era prompted answers that subtly drew a line between the original core and the players who came later. None of it was loud enough to become a headline on its own, but taken together, it painted a picture of two players who shared championships without ever truly closing the gap between them. The latest controversy did not create that distance. It simply made it visible for the first time. What has made this feud attract such widespread attention is precisely that it is not a surface-level argument between two players who used to be teammates. This is years of unresolved history finally breaking into the open, and every reaction adds another layer to a story fans have been following for nearly a decade. Durant's comments reopened debates that many assumed had cooled down, while Klay's willingness to respond publicly made it clear that certain subjects still carry real emotional weight long after they last shared a practice floor. The reactions from across the NBA world only intensified the conversation further. Fans, analysts, former players, and media figures quickly split into two camps that reflected the same division that has surrounded Durant throughout his career. One side argued that Durant was simply offering an honest basketball opinion, one rooted in genuine analysis rather than any intention to disrespect his former teammates. They pointed out that Durant has always been willing to engage in basketball debates publicly, and that holding his opinions against him simply for voicing them seemed unfair. The other side argued that there is a meaningful difference between offering a basketball opinion and publicly minimizing the accomplishments of the players who stood beside you when you won your rings. For this camp, Durant's comments were not just analytically questionable, they were a form of disrespect toward teammates who gave up individual glory to be part of something bigger. And that kind of disrespect deserves to be called out. The debate rapidly expanded well beyond statistics and roster comparisons, turning into a much deeper conversation about leadership, loyalty, gratitude, and what it actually means to honor the people who helped you reach the top. Sports television spent days on it. Podcasts dedicated entire episodes to breaking down every angle. Former NBA players with no direct connection to Golden State were pulled into interviews and asked to weigh in, and almost all of them gravitated toward the same underlying theme. In professional basketball, the relationships built during championship runs carry a weight that is supposed to last long after the final buzzer sounds. When those relationships fray publicly, it forces everyone to confront the gap between a polished image of team unity that championships project and the complicated human reality beneath it. The Durant and Klay situation became so magnetic precisely because it made that gap impossible to ignore. When you lay out the entire timeline from start to finish, the picture becomes remarkably clear. It started with Durant comparing the newly assembled 76ers to the legendary 2017 Warriors, a comparison that immediately stirred debate. It escalated when his individual player breakdown appeared to minimize the careers of Klay Thompson and Draymond Green, the two teammates most closely tied to the Warriors' championship identity alongside Stephen Curry. Klay responded publicly and firmly, breaking his usual silence in a way that instantly amplified the story. Draymond then stepped in with a combination of social media posts and podcast analysis that gave the controversy both viral momentum and substantive depth. Beneath all of it sat years of accumulated history, from Durant's complicated place within the Warriors' culture, to the 2018 locker room confrontation with Draymond, to Golden State's 2022 championship without him, to the 2026 All-Star Weekend burner account controversy that had already put Durant's relationships around the league under a microscope. None of this happened in isolation. Every piece of this story connects directly to the one before it, forming a narrative that makes complete sense once you step back and look at the full picture. Kevin Durant, Klay Thompson, and Draymond Green will always be connected through one of the greatest dynasties in NBA history. That bond is permanent and cannot be erased regardless of how many public disagreements follow. But recent events have made one thing undeniably clear. Old disagreements have a way of resurfacing long after the trophies have been handed out and the celebration has ended, especially when the people involved have never fully addressed what was left unresolved between them. Whether this feud eventually cools down or continues escalating through the rest of the offseason into the season ahead, the latest exchange between Durant and his former Golden State teammates has already become one of the most talked about NBA storylines in recent memory. It captures everything that makes professional basketball fascinating beyond the games themselves: championship history, personal pride, legacy debates, and years of complicated relationships colliding in real time on a public stage. The rivalry between Kevin Durant and the Warriors core is far from over, and as long as any one of them has an